I hope that you are going to find lots of value, lots of information and clarity from this evening's Tubules Live. It is a topic where we get lots and lots of questions from everyone. And it is also a topic that I think has been on the minds of yourselves as well. In case you've not heard about this, there's been a virus around for the last maybe couple of years now, and it keeps getting more and more interesting. It keeps getting more and more, the viruses, the mutants, the Omicron as the latest one, and we need to be on top of this. The guidelines for the cross-infection came from the CDO's office the other day, from NHS England, and then this has turned up. So where do we stand? In addition to that, we have all been working through the vaccines, through the boosters, and everybody has had different thoughts and different processes. My name is Dhru Shah. I am your host for this evening. I am the founder of Dentinal Tubules. Dentinal Tubules was set up to help and inspire the dental profession, to guide the dental profession through challenges and also difficult times. And never have we had a more difficult time than the profession had over the last 18 to 20 months. And we have been hosting live streams, Tubules Live. We've been putting up content. We've been putting learning content. We've been doing everything. And for our premium members, there is now a massive library of learning. And for our practice members, for your teams, there's the whole practice section, the CPD dashboard, and so much new functionality. Ultimately, we want to make sure we keep the profession informed, engaged, energized, inspired, and positive through all these challenges, because at the end of the day, the people who matter are our patients. The people who matter are our teams, each other, and the people who matter are us as healthcare professionals. And if we can look after all those people who matter, and if we can give you something positive from that, then that is what Tubule stands for. On a good news note, for those of you who may not have known, 3% of Dentinal Tubules income goes towards the Tubules Foundation, where we build schools for little children around the world. And I'm very pleased to say that our first project that was undergoing in Voi, Kenya, the school building is complete. Some of you may have seen the video, some of you may not have. The entire building is complete, furniture is going in, and soon we will be putting the books and everything. Our first foundation project, making a change around the world, is also pretty close to completion after 4 years of extreme hard work. We welcome our current members, we welcome our past members, and so many of you are new to Dentinal Tubules, listening to this for the first time. We welcome you. Under this video, on the Tubules Live page, you will see a small box where I've just written good evening. If any of you have any questions, please type them in that box and we will happily relay to this evening's speakers who are informing and giving us the knowledge. In addition to that, if you do have any queries or anything, please pop them in the box as well. If you can hear me, just type in the box, you can hear me, so I know that I'm loud and clear, and that's the same for this evening's presenters. Tell us where you're listening from, tell us what your concerns are or your questions are about this evening's topic, and I hope you get lots of value. That's all for me from the introduction. The rest of it is from Julia Furley and Laura Pearce from JFH Law. Now, Julia Furley and Laura have been on Tubules before. Through the pandemic, they gave us a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, especially when we needed the legal side of the expertise. And I remember, Julia, there was a panel when we were talking about SOPs and introduction in practice as well. And what a long way we've come from there.
Absolutely.
So from that,
it's a lifetime ago, isn't it?
It feels like a lifetime ago. And from there, we're talking about the vaccination. At that point, I don't think there was a vaccine that had developed. So in 12 to 18 months, it's amazing how far everything has evolved. And I suppose the new announcements by the government and everything else brought this topic about. Yeah. So
absolutely. Incredible how times have changed. I don't think we thought we'd be discussing this perhaps 18 months ago, but it's a necessary evil now, I'm afraid.
It is. And I suppose we'd like to hear your view. What I will do is I'm going to keep quiet now, and I'm going to pass it to Laura Pearce and Julia Furley for this evening's Tubules Live. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It's a real pleasure to be on a Tubules Live. I know that how helpful and informative these things are for everyone. So hopefully we will add a little bit of value this evening as well. just a little bit of an introduction. For those who don't know me, my name's Julia Furley. I'm a barrister and founding partner of JFH Law. So we are a law firm. We're based in Camden, but we represent dentists and dental practices all over the UK. And really that's our areas of expertise. We sometimes do contract work, fitness to practice work, you name it, we do it for dentists. So I hope we're a one-stop shop for dental practices. Laura and I have worked together now for many, many years. She'll look a bit exhausted by this, but again, Laura's incredibly experienced with all things dental, advises dental practice on buying and selling, lots of knowledge about employment law and regulatory work. So that's us. Now, I won't hang around with us because we have a lot to get through this evening. This is really what we're going to cover. I'm going to take the first half. So I'm going to cover the legal side of things. So what does the law currently say? When is it going to come into force? How is it going to be applied? And really, and I think for some people, the crucial bit is what are the exemptions, if there are any? And how should you choose to, what sort of legal challenges are there that are available? We'll also look very briefly at what the CQC's role is going to be in enforcing the changes that are coming about. And after I've gone through that, Laura is going to give a little bit more guidance on the sort of practical considerations for dental practices. So really how these changes are going to impact not only on the employed staff, so employed nurses, reception staff and so on, but also to self-employed associates within the business, and how a practice is going to manage the implementation of what is really a large policy change for businesses, and what you are going to have to do in the event that you're an individual who doesn't want to be vaccinated, or you are a practice who needs to implement these changes. So what sort of procedural policy and contractual changes are you going to need to implement within the practice? So moving on to the first, excuse me, it's not COVID. Moving on to the first part is, what does the law actually say? Because there's quite a lot of misinformation out there at the moment. So it's quite important that we start with a sort of baseline of what the legislation is. First of all, anyone who is suggesting that vaccination is going to be mandated more generally across the population is wrong. There has been a long history in the UK of freedom of choice when it comes to taking a vaccine. So unlike many other European countries, we don't mandate vaccines within schools. We don't make it a prerequisite of education for things like the HPV or MMR. We really leave it to the individuals to choose, and that is enshrined in legislation. So the Public Health Control of Disease Act of 1984, sounds exciting, specifically excludes mandatory vaccination within the general public. So the government cannot mandate individuals to be vaccinated without first obtaining an individual's consent. So that is our starting point. And it clearly means that if the government can't force you generally, and I'm not talking within the workplace, to be vaccinated, neither can an employer. So to force someone, and I mean really force someone to do it, would almost certainly amount to a civil tort, but would possibly amount to an assault, to a crime. So we really do have a long history of freedom of choice in England and Wales. However, there have been some significant changes over the last 2 years, and changes in the way that we, or the freedoms that we expect in our country, which I don't think that any of us would have anticipated or maybe even consented to prior to the pandemic. So we've really had to change the way that we think about what our freedoms mean and how they can be exercised. So the Health and Social Care Act is an act that you are probably all, I say familiar with, but you know, as familiar as you can be with a piece of legislation, probably you are aware of, because it's the legislation from which the CQC derives its powers. So when the CQC are visiting your dental practices, they are using legislation, it's the Health and Social Care Act, in order to govern how they monitor the work that you do and how they enforce sanctions and so on. Now, there was an actual amendment that you'll all be familiar with because of the news. So the Health and Social Care Act Regulated Activities Amendment, Coronavirus Regulations of 2021, the regulations. Now, this was laid before the Houses of House of Parliament, so Commons and Lords, on the 22nd of June, and it was approved by the House of Commons finally on the 13th of July of 2021. Now, this is the piece of legislation that dealt with social care. So whether the mandatory vaccination of social care workers, so care home workers. The regulations came into force on the 11th of November of 2021. And there has been quite a lot of press, quite a lot of concern about those regulations. And you would have all seen in on the news, various people saying the sort of negative impact this will have on staffing of care homes. Now, the justification for the mandating of vaccines for care home staff, now this is according to the current guidance, is as follows. So there is evidence to suggest that the COVID-19 vaccine also prevents those who catch the virus from infecting other people. Research by Public Health England shows that those who do become infected 3 weeks after receiving one dose of Pfizer-BioNTech or AstraZeneca vaccine were between 38% and 49% less likely to pass the virus on to their household contacts than those who were unvaccinated. They also, excuse me, say, although we have seen strong take-up of vaccination among care home residents, there are some who cannot be vaccinated and some for whom vaccination is less effective. Some residents will therefore continue to be at greater risk of the consequences of COVID-19. This winter, a potential combination of COVID-19 and flu would be life-threatening for care home residents who may be at high risk due to their age, underlying health conditions, or a disability. So those were the very clear justification for the mandation of the vaccine within care homes. And following the regulations coming to force in November 2021, in fact, it's been quite quiet with the unions and the care homes. So we don't know exactly what the impact was of that legislation. But that is really the framework that we're going to look at when it comes to amendments for the Health and Social Care Act moving forward for the healthcare workers. So when will the rules come into force and when will the legislation be amended for care home workers, healthcare workers more generally? Now, we don't yet have an amendment to the regulations for healthcare workers in any draft form. We contacted the Department of Health and they directed us straight back to the website and the guidance that's on there. So unfortunately, I'm not able to give you a sort of sneak preview of what the legislation is actually going to say, but I think we can make some educated guesses from the guidance that's been drafted so far and from obviously the previous amendment for care homes. There is a planned 12-week grace period between the regulations coming into force and the implementation. But the Department of Health guidance does say that the planned enforcement date is the 1st of April of 2021, quite ironic for some people, I think, but 1st of April 2021. So just to be clear, the grace period is up to the 1st of April. And it's clear that you must have had at least 2 doses of an authorized vaccine by that date. Now, the date is subject to parliamentary approval and will be voted on by the House of Commons. But just to give you an idea for how the vote went for the care home, was that the regulations were voted on by 319 votes to 246. So there was a large parliamentary majority in favour of these measures, and there's no reason to think that that parliamentary majority won't remain the same for this next mandation. So, but nothing is done, obviously, until it's done. But I think it's best for practices to work on a basis that it's likely to be approved by January 2022, and will come into force by April. This is not the sort of webinar where we are going to give a view one way or the other of whether this is right or wrong. It's a matter of entirely of personal choice for individuals whether they take the vaccine. The only idea here this evening is to give everyone, I hope, a good idea of how they can manage these changes. So just a pointer for those people who are concerned about these measures, you do still have some limited time to lobby your MP, because it doesn't look like the draft legislation will be put before Parliament until late December, early January. So for those people who are concerned, that is what you should be doing at this stage, to voice your concerns to your local MP. Who will the legislation apply to? Well, again, this is very, very straightforward. There is no deviation here. It's going to include all health and social care workers. So that's doctors, nurses, dentists, domiciliary care workers, and it will include everyone who's in NHS practice, private practice, or even volunteers. So even people who go into hospitals and what have you, or volunteer agencies. All of these agencies will need to be to comply and to be vaccinated. For dental practices, it's also going to include, all businesses, but particularly for dental practice, it's also going to include ancillary staff. So that is your reception staff, patient care coordinators, runner nurses, anyone who is likely to have face-to-face or any social contact with any service users. So if you are thinking that there may be people within the business who really are sort of secreted away, or admin only, sit in an office and have no public facing role, then they would not need to be vaccinated on the face of the information we have now. But otherwise, if anyone is dealing in any way with face-to-face contact with staff, they will need to be vaccinated. Now, again, the reasons for the policies at the moment, I suspect will be quite contentious for some, but they're broadly similar to the guidance that has been given to care home staff. So really, it's to ensure the maximum number of NHS staff are vaccinated, and will keep the most vulnerable patients and gain the greatest possible levels of protection against infection. So really, the whole idea about the mandatory vaccination is to protect the vulnerable, with a particular concern on the fact that the majority of people, of course, who use hospitals and doctor surgeries tend to be those who are elderly, those with disabilities, and those who are seriously ill, so they face a higher risk. The idea is also to protect workers. As you will know, there's been a significant problem with absences from hospitals and doctors' surgeries because of people who are being infected by the virus and having to self-isolate for extended periods. And again, the idea that the vaccination program has been successful in weakening the link between infection, hospitalization, and deaths. So findings from the recent REACT study have shown that fully vaccinated people were estimated to have around 50 to 60% reduced risk of infection, including asymptomatic infection, compared to unvaccinated people. So it seems like the research is moving in the direction of showing that there is there's a reduced risk of transmission if you are vaccinated. But it is clear that this policy and these changes are very much directed at NHS and predominantly those people who work in hospitals or deal with vulnerable, so for example, domiciliary care workers. And it might create something of a conundrum for some dental practices, particularly as you're not dealing predominantly with vulnerable people. So the same sorts of criteria and considerations may not be at the forefront of your mind. So there are certainly some questions over the need for mandatory vaccinations within a dental practice, particularly dental practice doesn't treat maybe elderly or vulnerable people. But again, that's something that will need to be debated, I imagine, over time and considered very carefully by those people in Parliament. So the big question for many people is, are there going to be any exemptions? Now, the current exemption for care home workers are incredibly limited. So I suspect the answer for dentists and dental practices is going to be very limited exemptions for you guys as well. So the only statutory exemptions at the moment are that for clinical reasons, and they've described B, the care home worker, should not be vaccinated with any authorized vaccines. So the obvious one, if there is a medical reason for the individual not to be vaccinated, then that is the only real exemption. But also if they're under 18 years of age. Now, I wonder, bearing in mind the vaccine policy as regards the vaccination of children over the age of 12 has changed since the care home legislation was brought in July of this year, whether that might also change with the healthcare worker regulations. So we'll have to watch that space to see whether healthcare workers will also be vaccinated if they are under 18. So I appreciate that won't be many members of your staff, but it may, for sort of 16, 17-year-olds, job, so work experience, for example, trainee nurses may all have to be vaccinated. There are also very minor exemptions for the care home workers. So B has to provide emergency assistance, urgent maintenance assistance, or attending as part of emergency services. But again, these are really minor exemptions and they are unlikely to impact on dental practices. We have been asked by a number of people, as soon as we started talking about doing this webinar, the question that's come up over and over and over again is, well, will there be any other religious or philosophical exemptions to this? Are there any ways? I don't believe in the vaccine, I don't want to take the vaccine. Are there any other possible ways of avoiding having to do this whilst also being able to maintain my career? Now, the difficulty here is the short answer is probably going to be no, but I will expand on that a little bit more. Now, first of all, religious belief. Most mainstream faith organizations have actually endorsed the vaccine. I think the Pope came out a few weeks ago and said that it's a good idea, but there will be some people who have a religious objection to medical treatment. I think, and it's only because of a case I've been doing recently, I think that in fact Scientologists may not believe in the use of vaccines. So there's a potential interesting case in the future to see whether there is actually a legitimate religious objection. Other people have also talked about veganism, but I understand in fact that, and again, I'm no expert on what goes into or how vaccines are made, but MHRA has confirmed that most of the vaccines that are being used don't contain any components of animal origin, albeit medicines are tested on animals. And the Vegan Society has actually come out and said, you know, take the vaccine and they don't support any sort of boycott on it. And there's, of course, I think something that hasn't been tested in the courts before is anti-vax beliefs. So people who have a strong philosophical belief that vaccines are inherently wrong. The difficulty with that in the dental community is that you've already taken a hepatitis vaccine. So it would be extremely difficult to argue that. However, and in any event, religious and philosophical objections will not provide you with an exemption once vaccine mandate is brought into law. So if I, within my business, decided to implement a mandatory vaccine policy within JFH Law, one in my staff, I happen to employ a vegan, and they raised an objection, then they may have an argument where if I couldn't justify that it was a necessary thing to do to protect other people or to protect my clients, then they may have a claim for discrimination. But you will not have any sort of claim for religious or philosophical discrimination once the once the mandate is brought into law. So in the absence of a medical exemption, an unvaccinated worker will not be able to continue to work in healthcare. It is as stark as that, I'm afraid. For employees and employees only, an employer would need to look for an alternative non-public facing role. But Laura and I have discussed this a little bit, and we've been struggling to see how it would be possible within a dental practice to find sufficient, and any real roles, potentially a few admin roles, but it'd be very difficult to find roles for people who would have no contact with patients. So I am afraid that the excuse me, the decisions that people are going to have to face are rather stark, and they're going to have to face them rather quickly over the next few months. And Laura, as I say, will talk a little bit more in a moment about how you can implement and how you can deal with concerns and queries that staff have. Are there any other legal challenges? And again, there will be lots of people out there saying, well, we don't think that it should be legal challenge, we think it's a good idea, but there will be lots of people again that don't feel comfortable with this. So just to cover everything off. The regulations that amend the Health and Social Care Act are what's known as secondary legislation. So the Health and Social Care Act itself is primary legislation, and it had to be debated in full in Parliament. And it went through up and down, through the House of Commons, laws, and it would have gone backwards and forwards and been amended. And there would have been so much time for your MP to debate it that it's not possible once it's passed into law to challenge primary legislation. But secondary legislation, which is what this is the tinkering, if you like, with the primary legislation. It's changing regulations to change and tinker and mess around with the law a little bit, without the need for that whole parliamentary scrutiny which takes so long in normal circumstances. So it is possible for affected parties to consider what's known as a judicial review of secondary legislation. It is not easy, and it can be costly. And the first thing would be application must be made promptly. So if anyone is considering a legal challenge, you need to move swiftly. And as soon as that piece of secondary legislation is drafted and laid before the Commons, you would need to move that forward. So what is the test for judicial review? So it's the usual range of procedural and substantive grounds is available to claimants seeking judicial review of secondary legislation. This includes, number one, it was not made within the scope of the power of enabling primary legislation. Now, I think that's a non-starter. Second, when it was made, irrelevant considerations were taken into account, or relevant considerations were not taken into account. So I suppose that's what we're talking about, the need within a dental practice versus the need within a care home or a hospital. The legislation is irrational. So it's no reasonable person could think that it is sensible or rational. It was not made in accordance with the correct procedure or is otherwise procedurally unfair, including any consultation undertaken prior to the introduction of the legislation, or it was made in breach of human rights. Now, I've been asked on a number of occasions whether anyone has been challenging this, whether human rights lawyers have been challenging any of these changes to the law. And the short answer is yes. There is a judicial review which has been initiated in respect of 2 care home workers, I suspect being funded by other parties, but in their name. And they are arguing that the law contravened the Public Health Act. So that original act that I was talking about at the beginning of this evening about that prohibition on the mandation of vaccines in the public more generally. But we know that that challenge would fail for healthcare professionals because vaccines are already mandated elsewhere. It's different than care home workers. But they are also bringing about some human rights arguments. So they are arguing that the regulations interfere with the public's right to bodily integrity, and it's severe, unnecessary, and disproportionate. They also are arguing that regulations will disproportionately impact on women and those who identify as Black Caribbean and Black British for multiples of social reasons, and I suspect also the history of vaccination issues when it comes to BAME groups. So they're arguing a contravention of Article 8, so right to family life, and Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So we shall see what happens with that. But I think the arguments in respect of care home workers are in many respects very different than they are to healthcare workers. So I suspect a lot of those arguments may not cross over for healthcare workers. That being said, because of the points we raised earlier, it isn't possible to lump all healthcare workers into one category. It's not possible to say that someone who works within a hospital trust on a geriatric ward at Watford General, I don't know, is in the same situation as someone who works in a private specialist referral practice in Harley Street. They aren't comparable, and therefore this sort of broad brush approach to legislation might not be appropriate. So there may be some arguments that are going to be taken, but I don't know anyone who is going to take them yet. What I would say is, if anyone is waiting for the unions, such as Unison, who normally represents most of the care home care workers and health workers, they do not appear to be taking any legal action. So those are really the only potential challenges for those people who are uncomfortable with the idea. For those who are not uncomfortable, then you need to be preparing for the 1st of April, because it is almost certainly going to come about. So who is responsible for compliance? Our friends, the Care Quality Commission. So effectively, the guidance obviously isn't out yet for healthcare workers, but it is out for care home workers. And under the Regulated Activities Amendment, the person responsible for ensuring that anyone who enters a care home is either vaccinated or exempt is the registered person. So that is the person who's registered with the CQC as the manager or the service provider. So whoever within the business who is currently the registered manager, this is your job, this is your responsibility. So you need to be aware of what the rules are and when you need to start implementing them. The CQC's guidance, I think at the moment, is really woeful, but that doesn't surprise me. Effectively, what they've said is they're going to add the following question to the provider's information return once the duty is in place. How are you assured that those you employ and deploy within your service are vaccinated in line with government requirements? So you are not going to have to keep evidence of individuals' vaccination, but you're going to have to keep some sort of record of the fact that you've checked and that you know that that individual is vaccinated, and probably when they were vaccinated, because I imagine that with the advent of these boosters, then people are going to have to keep this obligation, this mandate up to date. And they're saying that they're going to use the regulation 18, so how you manage your staff, and regulation 19, who is a fit and proper person to provide the services. And now, effectively, you cannot be a fit and proper person to provide the services if you are not vaccinated. So that's something to bear in mind. Enforcement will be done in the normal way. And to be fair to the CQC, they have always taken a very positive approach, I think, to enforcement. It may not feel like that all the time, but effectively they are going to try and use the sort of carrot rather than the stick. So they're going to look at the failure to comply result in the CQC taking proportionate action. So they'll look at the seriousness of the breach. Is it a multiple or persistent breach? And does it require criminal enforcement? And then they will sector the enforcement priorities. So, for example, if you have an individual staff member who has perhaps provided incorrect information or is reluctant to be vaccinated, and you're trying to take measures in order to coax them to be vaccinated, that would be treated very differently to a practice's overall refusal to be vaccinated at all, which I suspect will be taken rather seriously and would likely to result in enforcement action, which can of course include not only the practice being shut, but it can also result in criminal charges being brought against the practice owner and the practice manager. So worth considering very carefully if you decide that you're going to make some sort of protest against this. Acas have been quite useful. They've given guidance, which can be found on the Acas website. So checks can be carried out by other employees, but it's the registered person who's legally responsible for the checks and for keeping the record of them. So if you're going to delegate the role, that's fine, but the registered person has to really make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. This is obviously for care homes. Care homes must keep a record of the date they check the vaccination or exemption status. So it's a little bit like your GDPR stuff. Keep a record of your data, but don't necessarily keep a copy of the data itself. And if someone has a medical exemption, in order to protect their confidential medical information and comply with data protection law, the reason for the exemption should not be recorded. So again, it's limiting the sort of data that you are retaining for members of staff. And finally, NHSX, and so the online portal, is now considering whether the COVID pass, the NHS COVID pass service, could be used to support this particular change. So would that be sufficient for staff to check and demonstrate vaccination status? And individuals can choose to use the existing NHS COVID pass to show the registered person their vaccination status. I'm not sure, apart from bringing a little blue card, how else you would do it anyway, but they're looking at making that a sort of formal part of the way in which this is implemented. So that is the sort of first part, the legal part of these changes. And I'm going to hand over to Laura now, who is going to take you through what needs to be done to implement those changes.
Yeah, so as Julia said, I'm going to go through what are the practical implications for dental practices when this law comes into effect. So how will the changes impact staff? Well, as Julia said, any member of staff who wishes to continue to work in a dental setting and who has face-to-face contact with patients will have to have a vaccine if they want to continue working. So as Julia said, there's very few exemptions unless it's medical grounds. If there are no medical exemptions, they need the vaccine. So how are you going to manage this with staff? So first of all, it's obviously best to get consent if possible. So hold meetings with your staff early on, explain what the new legislation means, what it's going to require dental practices to do, what its impact is going to be on dental practices. So explain to staff what the legislation is so they can understand why you're making changes in the workplace. The next step will be to encourage as many staff as possible to have the vaccine. Confirm to staff what the deadlines are for getting the first and second doses so that they can have their both vaccines by the April deadline so that they can meet that deadline. Let staff know what evidence will be required. So as Julia said, there's the NHSX. They're looking at whether you can use the COVID passport. It may be the blue card that you got when you first visited your GP. But let staff know what it is that you will expect from them. If it's going to be a medical exemption, then you'll need the staff to provide that from their GP or whatever consultant, wherever that's going to come from. So you'll need to satisfy yourself that the medical exemption is valid. So let them know what it is that you'll expect from them in relation to medical evidence as well. Let them know how you're going to process that information. So as Julia said, it's a record. You don't need to keep the data. It's just a record that you've checked that your staff either have the vaccination or have an applicable medical exemption. So let them know that that's how you're going to keep a record of it. Let them know how to book the vaccine. I mean, it may be obvious, but some staff might not understand how they need to do it. So give them information, as much information as possible. Make it as easy as possible for them to book their appointments and get their vaccination. Let staff know what you're going to do with time off for appointments for the vaccination. Obviously, if staff are part-time, then one would expect them to get the vaccine on their days off. But if they're full-time, you might want to give some allowances to give them some time off to go and get their vaccination so that they can help you comply with the law. What about side effects? Some people have been feeling a bit groggy after having it, you know, having flu-like symptoms, maybe not being able to attend work. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to offer maybe a day's pay if someone does have side effects from it in relation to that? I would limit how much time, how much pay you're going to give. Obviously, you don't want to do it indefinitely, but you might want to give some leniency. You might want to let staff know that you're going to take these things into account and that you will pay them if they do go and get it and if they do have any side effects from it. Explain to staff what will happen if they don't get the vaccine. As Julia said, you know, you do have a duty to kind of look at alternatives, but that may not be possible. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail further on. But you should make it clear early on that if there are no alternatives, then dismissal is likely to be the outcome of this. And I think you need to make that very clear to staff from the outset so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to get the vaccine. Finally, have an open door policy for any staff wishing to raise individual concerns. If they're in a staff meeting, they might not want to say why they don't want to get the vaccine. So they might have very personal reasons for why they don't want to do it. So have an open door policy, let staff come to you, listen to what their concerns are. You may not agree with those concerns, but listen to them openly, have an open mind and try to respond neutrally to any concerns that they may have. Like I say, they may be something that's a bit more valid, that, you know, perhaps the employee is pregnant and she feels that she doesn't want to get it because of issues with that. So try and listen to it, try and understand and try and respond. It may be that you have to have another meeting with these employees to go away and get a bit more information to help them. It may be that you need to give them a bit, you might agree to give them a bit of leniency, which I'll come on to as well. But that's the first step. Manage expectations, explain what it is that needs to happen and explain what the consequences might be for staff. So risk assessments, we've had a couple of people asking about risk assessments and what needs to be done and what medical exemptions, what has to be done with that. Now, because this is government mandated that all staff have to do this, you don't need to do a risk assessment. You don't need to do a risk assessment on the vaccination program itself or for individual members that are refusing to have the vaccine. So no risk assessments are required on your part. If a staff member is claiming medical exemption, it's for them to prove it. So you don't need to send them to occupational health. So you don't have to pay for those services. It's for the staff member to come to you and show why they are saying that they are medically exempt. I've put on the slides there just website guidance for staff, so they can go onto this website and check how they can prove that they are able to get vaccinated, so what information they can provide. So that's helpful, you can pass that on to staff, but it's not your obligation, it's your staff member's obligation to show this. So monitoring compliance. Ask staff to provide evidence of vaccinations. It may be that a lot of your staff have already done this, so they can provide it easily straight away. You will also need to get the evidence, as I've said, for those that are relying on a medical exemption, so get that from them. Continue to speak to the individuals who are reluctant to have the vaccine, and again, just reiterate what the consequences are for not complying, i.e. that it will possibly be a dismissal if they don't comply with these regulations. So staff refusing to get vaccinated, ultimately it is the staff member's choice whether or not they want to get vaccinated. What you have to do then, when they've confirmed that to you, is you need to ensure compliance with the regulations. So how do you go about doing that? So as Julia said, you might have to look at alternative work. So are you able to offer any alternative work? Are there administrative roles in the back office that are purely administrative and don't require any face-to-face contact whatsoever? The issue that we thought about is that you might need those people to cover for reception, even if it's just the odd day here and there. They are then going to have face-to-face contact. So that is going to be a problem if your back of office staff do have to cover, because then you can't offer those roles as an alternative because someone will still need the vaccine in those roles. So unless there's absolutely no risk whatsoever of face-to-face patient contact, you'll have to consider whether or not you can offer any alternatives. If you are able to offer an alternative, make the necessary contract amendments to the contract. There's no obligation on you to provide pay protection if the administrative role is for less money. Ultimately, it's the staff member's choice not to have the vaccine. So you are trying to do what you can to accommodate them. And if the back of office role is on less money, then you can offer it on that lower pay. And it's up to the member of staff if they wish to take it or not. So that's what you need to do. I suppose another issue that might arise is if you've got a couple of members of staff that don't want the vaccine, only one administrative role in back of office that you can offer. If a situation like that arises, I would suggest that you have some kind of maybe interview process and offer it to the person who interviews the best for it, just to make it fair rather than picking someone, which could then lead to discrimination arguments later down the line. Are you able to offer another arrangement? Now, when I'm thinking of other arrangements, I'm thinking perhaps more temporary arrangements. So it's while the employee tries to obtain proof, or perhaps while they're a grace period. For example, I gave the example of a pregnant employee. I know that the advice is that pregnant women can have the vaccine, but you might feel a bit more leniency to say, well, maybe I will give them, paid leave or unpaid leave. When they've had their baby, they're going to get the vaccine. So you might want to look at that. There might be some undertaking training or tasks at home that you might be able to offer for a temporary period. If they haven't been able to get the vaccine in time but have promised that they will, you might want to look at temporary other arrangements just to accommodate your staff for that period. But those members of staff that haven't had the vaccine should not be working in their roles. So if you do give any grace periods, that's purely for them to get the vaccination, but that it's on the understanding that they will, or you'll have to look at dismissal. So if you don't have any alternative roles available in your practice, what do you do then? If the member of staff has less than 2 years service, then you can issue them with notice. You only get protection against unfair dismissal. You only get protection against unfair dismissal if you've got less than 2 years service. So you can just issue the person with notice. Given we're going to know quite early on when this is going to be implemented, you should be able to give enough notice so that the staff member completes their notice by the 1st of April. You can also pay in lieu of notice. You might decide there might be a clause in your contract that allows you to pay in lieu of notice. So if the member of staff has got 6 weeks notice, for example, when you issue it on the 1st of March, that does mean that there's an overlap after the 1st of April, and you can always pay those 2 weeks in lieu of notice if you want to. If the member of staff has more than 2 years service, then they're protected against unfair dismissal. So that means you have to undertake the normal dismissal procedures before dismissing that member of staff. Even though this is law that's being implemented, you still have to follow those procedures. So that's going through inviting them to meetings, confirming why you're looking to dismiss them, and the fair reason in this case is likely to be illegality and or some other substantial reason that they cannot continue to do their role. So you have to follow the procedures, invite them to a meeting, go through the disciplinary meeting with them, give them the reasons why you're dismissing them, and allow them the right to appeal that decision. But if you follow the necessary procedures, and because this is a legal requirement, I think it would be very hard done by for any employee to bring a claim against you for unfair dismissal in these circumstances. So if you the 2 examples I've given there are obviously with staff, whether they've got 2 years or not. Either way, you still have to give notice. So you will have to give both sets of employees the required notice that's in their contract for the statutory minimum. So what happens if there's any notice notice after the 1st of April? So like I said, if you've got 6 weeks, you give it on the 1st of March, that means there's a couple of weeks in April that the employee is around. Can you offer them some temporary work whilst the dismissal's going through, or you're undertaking the dismissal procedures, or they're still serving their notice? So can they do something usefully? They could work from home. Could they do some admin work at home? Back office staff, is there some training they could do? So that's one option. Or pay in lieu of notice is the other option. any period after the 1st of April, if the staff member doesn't want to do the temporary work and that, then you don't have to pay them to sit at home just because they've decided not to get the vaccine as well. So what is an employer's liability to a staff member who has severe side effects from the vaccine? So maybe something a bit more permanent than just feeling a bit groggy after having it. What happens if there's something a bit more permanent? Well, the employer, as the employee, will have no liability whatsoever for that. The vaccination is a legal requirement from government. So this isn't a situation where it's a health and safety issue. Have you failed to put a step somewhere or a sign somewhere? That's not the case here. It's a legal requirement. So employers will have no liability whatsoever if any staff member has a side effect from the vaccine. So what about self-employed staff? What happens if you have issues with your self-employed staff? So again, ultimately, you can't force the self-employed associate to get the vaccine. It's a personal choice. It's up to them. And if the associate refuses, it's for the practice to take action to ensure that they are compliant with the CQC regulations. So first of all, let practices know that this is going to, associates know that this is going to be implemented, and ask associates to provide evidence of their vaccine or evidence of an exemption, a medical exemption. So get that information from them as well. And how to deal with associates who refuse the vaccine. First of all, have a look at your contract. Does your contract contain a clause saying that the associate will not put the practice's CQC registration in jeopardy? This is a fairly standard clause in dental contracts. Across the board, it should be. So if this clause is in your contract, then in our opinion, you can issue notice with immediate effect. So you don't, if it says a 3-month notice period, you don't have to worry about that. You can say, well, you've breached our contract because you're putting my registration at jeopardy by not having the vaccine. So that's likely to be a fundamental breach of contract, allowing you to terminate with immediate effect. So this is quite useful if you do have it in your contracts and you're having difficulties with your associate staff. If you don't have a clause in your contract regarding assisting with CQC compliance and not putting that in jeopardy, if the contract is a genuinely self-employed contract, then it's not a fundamental breach that the associate doesn't have the vaccine, because technically they can send a locum to do the services. This is a contract between two businesses, as it were, to provide the services. So there's often a locum clause in the contract. So the associate could say, well, I could send someone else if I wanted to. So you won't be able to say that it's a fundamental breach as of itself. If the associate has confirmed they will not get the vaccine, then issue notice in line with the contract as soon as possible. So if there's a 3-month contractual notice, give the notice. Like we should be knowing in December, January what's going to happen with this. So you should have enough time to issue notice so that that expires on or before the 1st of April. If there's any unserved notice period after the 1st of April, well, the associate won't be able to treat patients if they don't have the vaccine, so they won't be able to attend the practice. If that's the case, then you don't have to pay them. You've got no obligation because they're the one that's not able to attend the practice to fulfill their contractual obligations. There is a question as to whether you enforce your locum clause against any associate that doesn't attend the practice. A lot of contracts have a clause that say if you do not utilise the facilities for 5 days or more, then you need to send a locum. So a practice will have to make a decision as to whether they're going to say to the associate, well, if you're not coming in, you need to send someone else. And if they don't, whether the practice looks to claim breach of contract and any losses flowing from that. The other alternative is to perhaps consider, do the parties negotiate a shorter notice period? If both parties know that the associate isn't going to come in on the 1st of April, do they say, well, look, let's just end the contract on the 31st of March either way and negotiate a shorter notice period between them? What if the associate refuses to confirm either way? They're just not giving you the information, they're not letting you know, they're not telling you if they're going to get it. You'll need to make a decision as to whether to issue the notice as soon as possible for failure to comply and saying you're not giving us the information, or wait to see if the associate changes their mind and take the course of action on the previous slide. Issue notice as soon as you do know, they won't get pay after the 1st of April, or try and negotiate a shorter notice period or enforce the locum clause. So GDC registration and vaccinations, we had a quick look on the GDC website to see what they're saying about all of this. Their guidance does state at the top that it's currently being updated given the government guidance that's just come out. What the current guidance does state is that there are 2 standards that the dentists have to comply with, and 1.5 requires you to provide a safe environment for patients, and 9.2 to manage the risks of your own health. The GDC don't require you to have the Hep B vaccination for registration. So we think it's unlikely that this is going to be a registration requirement, because there may be circumstances when a dentist wants to register but doesn't have any face-to-face contact with patients. So they don't need to have the vaccination. But obviously, if the GDC found out that you were treating patients without the vaccine, then you're likely to be in breach of those 2 standards, and disciplinary action could be taken as a result of that. So recruitment, what about recruitment going forward? Can you make it a requirement of employment? Well, yes, you're going to have to actually make it a requirement of employment. And I would suggest making it clear in your job advert that, that anyone who applies will need to have been vaccinated in order to undertake the role. Can you undertake interviews on site? Now, the reason I've put this on here is because it's unclear, but with care homes, the care homes were not allowed to let potential applicants on site unless they'd had the vaccination or were exempt. So we'll have to watch this space for that to see what it says about that. Can you ask new recruits if they've been vaccinated? Yes, and again, you'll have to ensure that you can comply with your legal requirements going forward. If they say that they're exempt, you can ask for evidence on offering the job with medical exemption. And we would recommend making any job offer conditional on providing a vaccination status or exemption status. And do not let anyone start working until this has been provided to you. So policies and procedures. We'd recommend implementing a vaccination policy just to set out all of your requirements, what you're going to do, recruitment and all of that. As we've said, have a record of vaccination status just in case of inspection, but this isn't a record of everything. It's just a record to say that you've checked that the person's had the vaccine or exempt. And as Julia said, don't add any medical information on that. Anything medical should be kept separate in a personnel file if you need to keep that. And then finally, with your contracts, you should be adding a clause to all contracts to make it a requirement. You probably already have this with your Hep B vaccination, so you can add something similar to the contracts. And you do this for new staff and for current staff, because obviously it's now a legal requirement that you have this, so you can update your contracts to confirm that that is what you are requiring. And I think that's the end from Julia and I, other than questions.
Great, and thank you so much, Laura. I just, funnily enough, Dhru, I know you'll be itching to jump in, but I'm just really intrigued by so many of these questions, and one in particular that's come up. Richard gets a gold star for being eagle-eyed enough to actually notice that we are, well, I think we're all labouring under a misapprehension in respect of the hepatitis B vaccination for the workplace, because someone else has asked the question as, how is this different to the Hep B vaccination? And Richard has very, very sharp eyes and has pointed out that in fact, we are labouring under a misapprehension that Hep B is not in legislation. It's not a legally mandated vaccine. It is a vaccine that has been effectively brought into practice by health and safety policies, and it is guidance from the Health and Safety Executive, and also has been adopted by most of the hospital trusts across England and Wales. And therefore nearly everybody incorporates it into its requirements. I think it may even be in the General Dental Services contract, but don't quote me on that because I'm not entirely sure. But it does in fact look like this is different. This might be the first actual mandated vaccine for the profession. I'm not sure it's going to change anything hugely apart from to say, well, this is very much a groundbreaking piece of law. But well done, Richard, for spotting that. I don't know, Laura, whether that changes your view on anything that we've said this evening.
No, not really. The law obviously makes it a higher requirement then than the Hep B.
Yeah.
Basically, is all I'd say to that.
Yeah. What it might do, and for people who are interested in challenging this, it might change the shape of a legal challenge. So it might, when the Department of Health have said, well, there's precedent for this, and always go back to hepatitis B. Obviously that won't work. There isn't precedent, albeit there is wide scale compliance with vaccination, and it's widely accepted across nearly all NHS trusts, and certainly within the dental profession, that Hep B is required to work in most dental practices. So the fact that people have accepted it's mandated to an extent, so by contract or by policy, I'm not sure that will help people who are against the idea of COVID vaccines more generally. Sorry, Dhru, I sort of jumped in there.
No, I think that's important, because that was one of the first questions anyway from Catherine Opie-Smith. So I was going to put that out, and Richard had spotted this. Very, very important. I think a lot of questions actually, and a lot of uncertainties and things like that. But if I try and put the questions in groups, it might make it easier. Now, one of the questions is about regarding this legislation. Is this something that's intended to remain forever? Or do you think it's going to be temporary in the pandemic? Linked to that, there are questions where, for example, one of the thoughts by Charlotte Bishop is that, is there likely to be any recognition of the antibody status in the future? So right now the vaccine's mandated. What are your thoughts on, and I know you can't predict it, but will they keep this forever? Or will they keep the antibody status?
At the moment, I think you can work on the basis that it's intended to be a permanent change. But, as we started off on this, the world changes so quickly at the moment, who knows? But yes, I think that there is certainly nothing within the regulations for the care home workers that suggests that it is time limited. And there's nothing that I could see within any of the guidance or any of the sort of debate documents that were put before Parliament to suggest it was time limited. So I don't anticipate that it will be time limited. Although that's not to say that in the future, in the same way that, that things change and COVID may become less of a concern in 5 years' time, and it's just no longer justified, not least for the expense of the vaccination. So, but at the moment, I think you should work on the basis that, yes, it will be a permanent change. And there's also no recognition within the statute for natural immunity. So it's not anticipated, and I think that would be incredibly hard for them to monitor, which I suspect is what they're considering. But yeah, no, natural immunity is not going to be sufficient, and it's likely to be a permanent change.
And I think you covered certain and quite clearly, this is legally mandated, and if someone doesn't need a vaccine, you'd have to give them notice, etc., which I'll go on. Yeah. But Jeremy Willits and a few others have said, dentistry is a safe place, and in all the legislation they've talked about care homes. Is there anything specific there isn't related to dentistry? But Jeremy Willits also asks, how does this comply with the Nuremberg Code and UNESCO's Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights? How does this sit in all of that? Because ultimately the long-term data with vaccines isn't known. So some people do feel that this is still in the experimental stage. And has there been resistance? Has there been pressure for this? And has there been anything specific for dental practice in this relation?
Right, I can't pretend that I can be an expert on Nuremberg and so on. So I'm not going to sort of, to go into the minutiae of that. But I think that's what I was sort of trying to say at the outset, in the sense of the potential for legal challenge. My view, whether you're pro or anti-vax, it doesn't matter here. Purely on a legal view, all of the guidance and all of the information that is currently available from the Department of Health is very much NHS focused, and it's very much focused on hospitals and on the treatment of the elderly and the vulnerable, and those with debilitating conditions. And that's the sort of justification for the legislation.
And
I don't think that proper consideration on the face of it has been given to the need for it in a dental surgery versus, I don't know, other public facing professions, not least that when you are in the dental surgery, you will be wearing PPE and you will have safeguards in place that should already minimize the risk of transmission. So those kind of justifications are certainly less strong for dental practices than they are for an NHS hospital. So I haven't seen any evidence of that, but I suppose this is going to depend on whether anyone within the profession has an appetite to mount a legal challenge on that basis. And I may stand corrected, but I think the only real way to do that would be to judicially review the policy. And you're talking about the Convention of Human Rights, so that on human rights grounds or on irrationality grounds. The difficulty you're always going to have is when you're asking a court to interfere with a policy that's based on scientific and expert evidence. So what you would need to do is you would need to know exactly what the scientific basis upon which the Department of Health had made the decision, and then you would need to see whether that held up to scrutiny, whether that was actually rational, or indeed whether there was any scientific evidence to justify the mandation of vaccines within a dental practice. Because it may well be that they haven't done the tests, the checks and the balance. They haven't made these questions in respect to dental practices. I just don't know, because it's not, this information is not publicly available. So what you might want to do is do a freedom of information request to the Department of Health to find out what the data that they're relying upon to justify the mandatory vaccinations within dental practices. That would be the starting point to see whether you could then legally challenge the decision moving on.
I'm going to go into a little bit of the questions related to the staff issues and visitors of practice, etc. A couple of questions, for example, from James Brosson. She says, at what stage do we then have to ask other visitors whether they have a vaccine or not? And do we need to do this? Because they're not within the practice, but there are other visitors, maintenance engineers, etc. They don't need it, I suppose.
Well, you shouldn't have to. Yeah, those are the sort of the sort of minimal exemptions I was talking about earlier on. So people who are coming in to do urgent maintenance work. I mean, I don't really know what the definition of urgent maintenance work is, but I suspect it's people who aren't employed to do maintenance within the business. So if you've got a gas leak or your plumbing's not working, that would be urgent maintenance. So your plumber wouldn't need to be vaccinated any more than your patients would need to be vaccinated. And I think someone also asked about dental technicians as well, whether they, if they came in on a one-off. No, not unless they're actually going to have patient-facing contact, which I think is probably quite unlikely. So,
I mean, for care homes, people like hairdressers that went into care homes to provide a service, yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we might have to watch this space, but the important thing is the face-to-face contact with patients.
And I think the other thing that we're looking at is, we're talking about exempt people, but what about medical exemptions? You've talked about medical. Have they got a specific set list of medical exemptions, what they are, or it's going to be like relying on the healthcare professional, the GP?
Exactly. You would need to get your GP to say this person is not able to take this vaccination for whatever reason. So I know I saw someone said, what are the exemptions? It's just not possible. And
what about pregnancy then? Where does that come into it? Because if the staff are either planning to become pregnant, can they defer this? Or would that
current guidance from the obstetrician, I can't remember what the society is called, but the authorities is basically that pregnant women should take the vaccine and that it's safe for people who are trying to get pregnant. So I mean, I know that's a hugely thorny issue, but that's the current guidance. So they would also require, at the moment, until there is evidence to suggest otherwise, they would also have to be vaccinated.
Now this takes into a different employment area. I'm going to ask a few questions. Joy Patel, for example, said he has only one dental nurse who works with him. She refuses to be vaccinated. What's the options for an employer? Somebody else asked that they have an associate in the middle of a big restorative treatment and they don't have any other expertise in the practice. And this associate says, I'm not going to take the vaccine. Daljit Sohal said, what if all of the staff say we're not taking vaccines? I think all of those kind of fall in that category where if they don't take the vaccine and we have to say, here's your notice, that's going to create a serious workforce challenge within the practice. What's the legal position there and advice you can give?
I mean, yeah, unfortunately, the law states that they can't treat patients. So as difficult as it is, that you are going to have to issue notice. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the only
terribly difficult. I mean, I know there are people who have been contacting us to say, I'm not going to take this vaccine. My staff don't want to take this vaccine, and it will be the end of our business. It's a terribly sad situation. And it's going to change people's businesses, and it's, but at the moment there's absolutely nothing you can do in the absence of a medical exemption, apart from, as I say, potentially legal challenge. But that's it. But I should say, I don't know, and maybe someone who's, because I know there's lots of people who are really well informed on this webinar this evening, but whether anyone actually knows how many people left the care home professions, because I know that people on the 11th of November, everyone was all over the press saying that 60,000 people were going to leave the profession. And I haven't been able to find any data to see the number of people who actually left, because I think they're estimating 120,000 people will leave the NHS. But again, it's really difficult to confirm whether these statistics or these facts that are sort of bandied around are actually true, and whether there is actually that sort of reluctance and reticence.
Anecdotal data from medical colleagues who do lots of rotas and things are saying they have a workforce problem. They're having to actually pull down, what are they called, stand down emergency doctors because there's a shortage of nurses. They're having to get doctors to do extra shifts because all these issues have created medical professionals who want to either go part-time or don't want to come back to work because of stress issues, all of this. So I think there will be an impact, but as you say, we don't have the tangible data that does this. Now, again, in terms of timing, and you talk about the breach, the notice period, Laura, but I suppose with Andrew Holland said this, if every staff member refuses vaccination and plans to leave on 1st April, and they give you a month's notice, it's going to make it impossible to recruit and adequately, create induction programs for an entirely new workforce. Any I suppose any tips on how to manage this sort of thing, and anything that you
start early on, as soon as possible, because the sooner you know which staff are going to say definitely no, I'm never going to get this, the sooner you can start recruiting to see if you can replace them. Okay,
and this is a big challenge actually. Now you kind of fix it. Will this law change? Do we feel between now and April we're still a moving feast because of possible judicial reviews, because of challenges, whatever comes along, where the government may say U-turn or change turn? Do you think that may be a possibility?
I think it's
the trouble, and the trouble with judicial review proceedings, and Julia can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the law will still be implemented on the 1st of April, even with judicial proceedings. So I'll give the example just because I know about this one, the employment tribunal fees. That was, I think, a year and a half later before it was found that they would overturn that. And then all of those fees were repaid, but it was still in practice for all of that time. So even if action is taken, it's going to be some time before a decision's made on it.
And I think that's what I was saying about if you it's not done until it's done, of course, although I think it's highly likely it'll go through. But for those people who do feel very strongly about it, then the best thing to do at the moment is probably to speak with your MP and see if you can lobby in that way, because that might have some impact. If they, if you're able to raise these issues, the fact that actually dental practices are not the same as NHS hospitals, private dental practices are incomparable. Not saying that there's a huge difference between private and NHS, but private dental practice versus an NHS hospital, there's just nothing similar about them. The risk in them is completely different.
And I think obviously Jeremy Willits and Emer Jung, a couple of you have started discussing this. It may be useful to form a group here, and I'm willing to create a WhatsApp group or something to get the conversation going. For whether it's you're talking judicial review or lobbying. Now, Carly Yarwood asks a question, which I suppose you can say, are there any grounds for reception staff to object to the vaccine on the basis that although their role is in healthcare, their interaction with patients is no more significant than shop assistance with customers? Or as long as they're there in the healthcare setting, this is the law. Yeah. Right, so they're fairly black and white about that. Now, talking about the liability, you said the employer doesn't have the liability if anything does ever go wrong with the vaccine or whatever in the future. I suppose that's crown liability or something the government takes on in the future.
And the legislation has been passed, though, to say I think that the government won't be liable should anything come of the vaccine.
It wouldn't be liable. Well, I think the drug companies certainly won't be. It's a big question, and I suspect it's unlikely there'll ever be any liability found, to be frank. And
the other,
if indeed there are any lies, I mean, I don't know. I'm personally not an anti-vaxxer. I've had a vaccine, but I certainly still respect the rights of others to hold a different view.
There are certain practice owners, and they pretty much run the practice, and some practice owners have felt uncomfortable and have not had the vaccine. Does this mean they cannot do clinical dentistry? Basically, that's the black and white of it at the moment, unless something's done. Here, another question is regarding the environment. How do you define healthcare setting? And this is based on the question that I read from Derek, Derek Santhanathan. Sorry, Derek, if I haven't pronounced it correctly. Can an unvaccinated manager work in an outbuilding without patient contact? Is it specifically patient contact that's not allowed?
Yes.
So is that the definition of the environment?
Yes.
So hopefully that answers your question, Derek, overall. And I think, as I say, a few groups are being set up. Jeremy Willits is talking about this, so I'm happy to put a link to a WhatsApp group in the chat later, or to pass it to Jeremy to get this going on. Rachel says something along the lines of, what about this? The government has also announced that an MATB1 stands as a medical exemption for pregnant workers who prefer not to be vaccinated until 16 weeks following the birth of their child. Are you aware of anything along those lines?
No. But I mean, if a GP is saying, not to get the vaccine, then you can rely on that. But once the 16 weeks is up, then the pregnant woman's going to have to make a choice.
Okay, makes sense.
But in any period, if it's after the 1st of April, then any period that they do have that exemption, then they won't be able to be on the practice. They'll have to be at home. I suppose there might have to be a medical. You can suspend someone medically while they're pregnant with full pay. So you might have to do that. You might have to medically suspend them or give them some work at home to do. But they won't be able to set foot in the practice. But once the medical exemptions up and the 16 weeks are over, then they're going to have to get the vaccine thereafter. But it's not something I'm specifically aware of.
The problem is, it feels like these are sort of pushing the issue down the road a little bit. We're not really solving the issue.
What needs to be done needs to be done, I suppose, is what it is, really, isn't it? Okay. I mean, I'm now putting on the chat WhatsApp group link. Jeremy, if you can get onto that group and message me, I'm happy for you to then take lead on that as well. I think this is important because people are going to have to plan for this. People are going to have to think about this. I think the consequences or the thoughts or the repercussions, whatever we want to call it, are to be taken at a serious level, really. You also saw the email address for JFH Law. If anybody does want to get in contact with them, I'm going to put the email address back on the chat as well. I hope Julia and Laura, you don't mind further questions.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And working through that. I think we're all going to have to work together to find solutions regarding all the challenges coming with this. But I this evening's talk has been very, very useful. Any last things that Laura or Julia would like to add on? I do apologize. I've not been able to put all the questions through because there are so many, but we've covered the main areas of questions that have come through. Anything else that you feel should be added based upon all the questions and discussions we've had?
No, I think really it's just about, again, anything legal is all about preparation and planning. So just, once you know what your obligations are, make sure that you are implementing and talking to people. The more information that you can give to people who are reluctant or worried or, concerned about what the future is going to hold, the better it will be, and the more able you're going to be to sort of manage the changes in your business, because inevitably there's going to be a bit of a shift now over the next few months in the dental world, whilst this is sort of dealt with. So really talk, communicate, and support people as much as you can.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing your evening and your time, Julia and Laura at JFH Law. If anybody has questions regarding this or anything legal and dentistry, I think basically Julia and Laura are perhaps one of the best informed. I always contact them with queries. So thank you for helping the profession over the last few months, to both of you, and spending your time as well. For the rest of you, the CPD link is in the chat below. Click through that. You can get CPD for this evening. Perhaps you want it, perhaps your mind is boggling about how do I get around this. And as you say, we've set up the WhatsApp group to provide support regarding this and the rest of the information for you as well. And there is the JFH Law email. Thanks everyone for sparing this evening. This is about the vaccine program and this virus that is continuing to evolve in our lives. Let's hope we get a few less variants as time goes along. Thanks everyone. Have a great evening. It's good. Bye, Laura, Julia.